So we're in the middle of the IndyCar summer break, and what does that mean? Well, it means that we get to start talking about the 2020 season and where the drivers and teams are going to end up by the time we get to St. Petersburg in 2020. Now, obviously, there was the huge shoe that needed to drop for the silly season, and that was where Alexander Rossi was going to go. And because he chose Andretti Autosport, it means that this silly season isn't going to be as crazy as maybe we would have thought it might have been had he decided to take the Penske ride that was offered to him and head over there. So a lot of the big teams really aren't going to move around quite a bit, but there are a lot of things in the works that have been reported that, certainly look like, if not certain they're going to happen. There's a lot of interesting possibilities for the 2020 IndyCar season. So let's start by talking about, like I said, the big teams. And I think we need to start at Andretti Autosport because, of course, the Alexander Rossi move was the big one. And he decided to stay at Andretti Autosport. And I haven't even given you really my detailed thoughts on this, but ultimately it came down to Andretti Autosport, in my opinion, and apparently his opinion too, because that's where he decided to stay, was the best choice. Now, certainly you can go to Penske as a fourth driver, and with the talent that Alexander Rossi has, he wouldn't have been out to lunch. Let's just put it that way, and he certainly would have been a threat every single time he would have gone to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. I mean, we know the Chevrolet, at least at the moment, now things could change when, we get some development in the offseason between Chevy and Honda, but at the moment, the Chevy is the best package for the Indy 500, and that was really what prevented him from passing Simon Pagenaud at the end of that race, the horsepower. So from that perspective, yes, he probably would have had a better shot in the Indy 500. But across the rest of the season, looking at championships, looking at race victories, and looking for, value for the sponsors, Napa and also AutoNation stepping up. This isn't the only time we're going to be talking about AutoNation in this video, because AutoNation themselves also stepped up on another car. But it's this is the first time that Alexander Rossi has had primary sponsorship from AutoNation for a long period of time. Easy for me to say. I think it's something like 7 races, and then Napa will be covering the other 9. And if you look at it, he has the combination at Andretti. He's got the engineer, he's got the team, he's got the crew, he's got the loyal sponsor. All of the things are gelling right now, so why would you change that? And obviously he thought the same thing. The rest of the team looks like it's going to stay the same. Ryan Hunter-Reay, Marco Andretti, Zach Veach, each of those drivers has sponsorship associated with them. It seems like for the majority of them, the team is fine with that driver lineup. Now, obviously, in a completely objective world, you probably dump Marco Andretti. You would bring somebody like a Connor Daly or a Colton Herta into that spot because I think it would be filled better, especially at this point. I thought about Zach Veach for a little bit, objectively whether or not I would keep him. Sponsorship, not a factor, but of course it is a factor. And, I kind of realized it's a second full season. If this is a slump year and he comes back next year and he's a race winner, then you're going to look pretty silly if he's winning races for another team and not yours. So I think Zach Veach needs another year to develop, and I think that's what he's going to get. So no problem there. Then we move on to Ganassi Racing, which again is another team that isn't going to change. Felix Rosenqvist and Scott Dixon, I think, judged solely on that performance at Mid-Ohio. Why would you change that? Now, I know a lot of people will kind of question whether or not Rosenqvist has a seat. He hasn't gotten a win yet, but I would probably argue that he's been more competitive than Ed Jones was in that situation. And unfortunately for Ed Jones, he was really thrust into a bad situation last year because it was really just like, well, we couldn't get Felix. Let's bring Ed Jones in and see if he's going to perform at the level that Felix was going to perform at, so we don't have to pay Felix to come to the team. Unfortunately, Ed Jones didn't meet expectations, even if those were lofty expectations, and Ganassi got the guy they really wanted. And just imagine the fact that I think Felix, Mid-Ohio was one of the few tracks Felix Rosenqvist has actually had laps in an IndyCar prior to this season, and you saw how fast he was there. So let's assume that he has a year's worth of experience at every other track he goes to. That's probably going to be a very significant thing, and then Scott Dixon, who needs to say anything else about him. Team Penske. Now, this is something that I want to say with an asterisk because obviously the full season drivers aren't going to change. In fact, it was reported just yesterday by Jim Aiello that, no surprise, Simon Pagenaud has been re-signed to the team after winning the Indianapolis 500. At the beginning of the season, there was a little bit of speculation from the media that maybe Simon wouldn't be around and maybe Alexander Rossi would take his place. But Robin Miller reported during the NBC broadcast that, if Rossi was going to come onto that team, it was going to be a 4-car effort, and apparently Rossi wasn't okay with that situation. So we have the 3-car team of Pagenaud, Power, and Newgarden. I don't think there's much else to say. I think those are the 3 best guys that Penske could get at the moment that aren't named Alexander Rossi. And certainly, going down the line, eventually Will Power is going to retire. It's probably not going to be anytime soon, but I think there is some rust starting to show there. There's no doubt about it. He's definitely made some uncharacteristic mistakes this year, and he hasn't been winning. And so, in Roger Penske's book, you look at how quickly he dumped Juan Pablo Montoya. That could happen to Will Power. It's obviously not going to happen this year, but, a couple years down the line, let's just imagine that a Colton Herta really starts to get hot. How quickly does Roger start to make those moves? Because Roger, he isn't one for nostalgia. He's a guy who's going to be thinking in the moment. Another team that's capable of winning races is Rahal Letterman Lanigan. Again, a team that is certainly not going to change. You've got 2 very established drivers there. You've got Graham Rahal and you've got Takuma Sato. Obviously, Graham Rahal's not going to leave the family team anytime soon, and Takuma Sato, very closely associated with Honda. There aren't a whole lot of Honda teams or seats out there, so it's not much to discuss. Then we go on to Ed Carpenter Racing, and this is where we start to get into some of the question marks. Again, you look at Ed Jones. He's a question mark, I think. Has he performed super, super great? No. Has he performed super, super badly? No. So, again, armchair quarterback here. If I'm Ed Carpenter, I would probably keep Ed Jones in that seat for 1 more year. I think Spencer Pigot is absolutely safe. I think some of his performances have been exceptional this year, particularly qualifying at the Indianapolis 500, even though his race wasn't that great. His qualifying performance was fantastic, and his Mid-Ohio performance was very good. So it looks like Spencer Pigot's really starting to gel with that team. I don't see a whole lot of reason that they would make changes, but then again, you never know. There could be an Indy Lights guy come up like Rinus VeeKay. I know he tested for that team. So, it just depends. Ed is usually pretty good about picking drivers for that, for the half-and-half oval Ed Carpenter car, and then insert road course ringer here. But, again, and then there's the other factor to consider, because Scuderia Corsa is bought into that team now, is whether or not Scuderia Corsa is high on Ed Jones. I think they probably are, because of their performance in the Indianapolis 500 this year, when it was truly a Scuderia Corsa effort. So, yeah, I think even though there's a question at Ed Carpenter Racing, I don't see that changing at all. Let's talk a little bit about a team that is a partial season team, but again, one that I think I need to bring up and mention because it's Michael Shank Racing. They got a commitment very early from their sponsor, AutoNation. Again, they've committed to Alexander Rossi, and they've also committed to Jack Harvey and Michael Shank Racing. Again, it's a partial season schedule for that team, but, they're committing this early. Certainly, that's a positive sign for that team. I hope at some point they finally actually get to full-time. They're not quite there yet. But Jack Harvey certainly proved this season so far that he is a very formidable driver. And a lot of times, remember, that car comes out of the Schmidt-Peterson stable. A lot of times, Jack Harvey, when he's at the track, and Schmidt-Peterson is too, he's outperforming them. So I don't think lost on a lot of people that, a lot of times he's outperforming Hinchcliffe and Marcus Ericsson. So, back in the Champ Car days, Dale Coyne Racing was usually a question mark, a major question mark. In fact, there's always been this joke because at one point, Dale Coyne literally entered cars at, I think it was St. Petersburg for Champ Car, and didn't have any names on the entry list, and you didn't know who was driving the cars until the first practice session. These days, it's a little bit more cut and dried. Now, I guess you could ask some questions about Sebastian Bourdais, whether or not he's going to come back. I think he almost certainly would. I don't see why he wouldn't. He's got a great situation at Coyne Racing with a team built around him with the help of Vassar and Sullivan. I don't think he would leave, but at the same time, you have to realize that Sebastian Bourdais is getting up there in age, and how much longer does he want to continue to do this? I mean, that's always going to be a question with some of these older drivers, especially when they're not winning as much as they used to in the past. Santino Ferrucci, I mean, man, Dale Coyne has really found a diamond in the rough there. I mean, unless Dale gets Santino's contract bought out by somebody else, he'd be foolish to let him go. He's performed so very well this season, really above what a lot of people thought Santino Ferrucci was going to be able to do. He's been fantastic, especially on the ovals. So, you know, redemption arcs aside, I think that that absolutely Santino Ferrucci will stay at Dale Coyne, because otherwise, you can't deny the results, is what I'm trying to say. Then we move on to Carlin Racing, and this has kind of turned into the Dale Coyne team, where you don't really know who's going to drive the cars week in and week out. I would expect at this point, and obviously there's a lot of time to go, that we're going to see a very similar, I don't want to say strategy, but I guess that's the word I'm going to use, to what we've seen this year with their driver lineups. It was reported by Robin Miller, I think in one of the NBC broadcasts, I think it was Mid-Ohio, that Max Chilton will do the Indy 500 next year. Now remember, he stepped away from the ovals because of the lack of cockpit protection, but by all accounts, cockpit protection is 100% going to be a thing next year, obviously with that Halo Shield thing. So Chilton, so essentially it'll be like last year with that 59 car, the Gallagher car, is that, you know, Chilton will run the first half of the season up to Indianapolis, and then I suppose it'll be up to him whether or not he feels the risk management is worth it to run on the ovals. And if not, you know, you'll see some sort of an oval ringer get into that car and hopefully try to bring it up to performance on the ovals. The second Carlin Racing car, that's where you kind of get into the head-scratching thing. It's like, does Charlie Kimball have money? Does R.C. Anderson have money? Does Sage Karam have money? Who's got the money for that car? Would you maybe see the Indy Lights champion, who looks like it's almost certainly going to be Oliver Askew, jumping into that car? You know, a lot of things up in the air about that car. Again, I think it's going to come down to money. I think like a lot of these kind of mid-pack to back-of-the-pack teams, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense toward Carlin, but if you look at a lot of these teams, you know, to be a business, to make this work as a business, you need to have funded drivers. And so a lot of times, unless you get really lucky with these teams, you're either, you know, bringing in 3 or 4 funded drivers for the season, or you're announcing one for the full season, one funded driver for the full season, you know, a month out from St. Pete after a test where you've made sure that they're not going to tear up more equipment than their sponsorship is worth. So I think that's where everything stands with Carlin. Now we get into really the juicy stuff. So Aero Schmidt Peterson Motorsports is something that I think we're going to be having to watch very, very closely this offseason. Why? Well, it's the meme. McLaren has said that they want to pursue IndyCar racing full-time. Sanity has prevailed. They have decided that doing the one-off is not going to win them an Indy 500. So they want to buy into another team. And it's been reported that team is Aero Schmidt Peterson Motorsports. And Jim Aiello even went as far this weekend to report that an engineer from the Schmidt Peterson team traveled with the McLaren Formula One team to Hungary for the Hungarian Grand Prix and spent time with the team. So you would imagine that this would not be happening if it was not a serious situation. If they weren't seriously considering having some sort of a buy-in, a merger between McLaren and Schmidt Peterson Motorsports. Now, there's another factor into this, is that Aero Electronics sponsors both McLaren and obviously Schmidt Peterson Motorsports, because they've bought into that team as well. So you've got to imagine that there's been a lot of smoky boardroom meetings between, you know, Aero Electronics and Sam Schmidt and Zach Brown, and this is kind of where everything is starting to get steered. So who does McLaren want to drive for them? Well, again, we go to Jim Aiello, and again, boy, real quick personal thing about Jim Aiello. It's a shame that he's going. Well, it's a shame for IndyCar that he's moving on to the Colts beat for the Indy Star, because damn it, he's really been killing it recently. But Aiello reported that Colton Herta is the guy who is the lead candidate for a McLaren effort full-time in IndyCar with Schmidt Peterson Motorsports. Now here's where things get really complicated, because Brian Barnhart of Harding Steinbrenner Racing, who of course Colton Herta currently drives for and is currently employed for more than 1 year, Barnhart said, we've got him on a contract. It's fairly ironclad. He'll be driving for us next year. But we've heard that before from the Harding team. Drivers like Gabby Chavez and even drivers like Santi Urrutia later came out and said, hey, I had a contract with this team and it didn't end up happening. And then Pato O'Ward as well. So, obviously that team is kind of shaky financially. They've had to, they've been struggling for sponsorship this year. And presumably they're struggling for it for next year. So, there is a question, can they afford Colton Herta? If they can't, then you got to imagine that McLaren would be, or somebody would be the first in line to snap up Colton Herta. Because I don't imagine a driver who's able to get a win in his third IndyCar race and has been as fast and really, honestly, consistent most of the time when his car stays under him. They wouldn't let him just kind of flitter to the wind. So where does that put Schmidt-Peterson Motorsports then? Do they go to 3 full-time cars? Do they have a McLaren-specific car, and then do they keep Hinch and I almost said Robert Wickens and Marcus Ericsson? Do they keep those 2 drivers on board? And I guess there is the question about Robert Wickens too. What happens if he ends up coming back? There's a lot of drivers all associated with that team, and it's like, okay, at some point, there's going to be some fat trimmed somewhere, I would imagine, unless, again, McLaren's would bring so much money into the program that they would be able to easily fund a 3rd car and crew a 3rd car, and keep all 3 drivers on the payroll. So let's assume Colton goes to Schmidt-Peterson. So what happens with Harding Steinbrenner Racing? Well, again, like I mentioned earlier, Oliver Askew is looking like he is going to be the Indy Lights champion. Of course, he is a driver for Andretti Autosport. Andretti Autosport is closely associated with Harding Steinbrenner Racing. It's not much of a stretch to think if Colton left that Askew would be able to get into that car for at least the first few races of the season, and then, funding permitting, they would be able to run the full season with him. It would get the Indy Lights champion in there. Askew would stay within the Andretti family without having to kick Marco out, or Veach. It would be Marco. We don't have to kick Marco out because for our fast Indy Lights driver, because we've got him on the team anyway. That's kind of what happened this year, wasn't it? In fact, it was that way with 2 drivers for a little while. But, that's the thing that I think these 2 teams are really where things are going to get really interesting is, what happens with Colton and then what happens with McLaren. And it feels like we're always talking about these guys. We've been talking about them for, 2 years now. But, assuming McLaren does this, assuming they buy into Schmidt and all these things happen, that's certainly the thing that we could end up seeing where we've got Colton Herta in a McLaren team with Schmidt-Peterson. But again, this is a harsh truth, but it's ultimately kind of what happened this year. Even though McLaren missed the show and they were associated with Carlin, who really had a struggle to make the show at the Indy 500, it's not like Schmidt really had a much easier time. Now, obviously, Marcus Ericsson was able to get easily into the field, but a lot of their other cars weren't quite as fast. So, that whole McLaren bump hype may still be happening for next year. And then, of course, we get to talk about our Lord and Savior, Fernando Alonso. What happens there? Is he a 4th or 5th car? Is he a 2nd McLaren? Does he show up at Indianapolis next year? Who knows? I'm trying not to talk too much about Indy 500 entry list stuff because that's more of a winter thing when more of these full-time things start to get solidified a little bit more. And that leaves one team, and that is AJ Foyt Racing. And I don't think it would be unfair to describe their season as pretty much a disaster this year. It's been bad for AJ Foyt Racing. There's no doubt about it. But here's something again. Coming from Jim Aiello, or at least Jim Aiello's podcast, I think Connor Daly was a little more suggestive of this, and Aiello was just more like, no comment. So we'll just have to see how this all goes. But it sounds like they're getting a new driver at Foyt. And it sounds like it's going to be Helio Castroneves. I know. I'm just as skeptical as all of you guys are. But we look at it and we kind of listen to what has been said, even kind of what Helio has said. You know, he's been pretty tight-lipped because, of course, he's driving for Penske. You don't want to upset Roger Penske. But from what we understand, or what we can kind of gather, is that Helio isn't all that happy in sports cars. He wants to be in Indy cars. He wants to drive Indy cars. He still wants to drive Indy cars full-time. He thinks he's competitive. I mean, he's driving the two-seater. Helio Castroneves is driving the two-seater. So that tells you, probably tells you more than you need to know about whether or not Helio wants to drive Indy cars each weekend. So this possibility of him going to Foyt is fascinating because Foyt is, I think, objectively the worst team in IndyCar racing right now. And Helio has never, and I don't want to say never, because he drove cars for Carl Hogan that weren't the best. But for the majority of his career, he has driven the best car on the track in IndyCar. Going to Foyt would be a huge cultural shock to Helio. Would he perform any better than Tony Kanaan? Who knows? Assuming this even happens at all. If it does happen, who's the odd man out? This is the thing. Because I feel like if AJ's calling the shots, which we know he's not fully, because obviously Larry Foyt, his son, runs the team. Would Larry go with Kanaan versus Laced, or would you keep Laced in there and hope that Helio maybe can help Laced kind of find some of that pace he had in Indy Lights? Or do you do what I think AJ probably would want to do, given the option, is to get a 3-time Indy 500 winner in there as well as Tony Kanaan and just have a super team for the Indy 500? That's also a possibility. So, and then what happens to Matheus Laced? Is his career just done if he's out at Foyt? It certainly feels like that way, and that would be a shame because Matheus Laced is a good kid, and I think he's kind of been, I don't just think, I know he's had the short end of the stick at Foyt, and he hasn't really been able to show his talents to the best of his ability. So that's kind of the thing that's like, whoa, what could happen? Because then even if Helio goes to Foyt, and let's say Kanaan stays as well, is there a fourth Penske car at the Indy 500? Who knows? What happens to that car? Does Juan Pablo Montoya come back? Does Penske just not run a fourth car? I certainly think that may be a possibility. What if Helio, here's another thing, what if Helio was looking at options for an IndyCar ride because of the possibility that Alexander Rossi might be into that team and in a fourth car, and theoretically would push Helio out of a chance even to run the Indy 500 because Penske would have all of his resources tied up in fourth cars. Now that Rossi's out of the picture, would Helio still consider Foyt? I don't know. That's kind of the story of silly season so far. I'm sure we'll have more topics to discuss as the year carries on. It's a long way to St. Pete, so a lot of this could change, but I can't wait to discuss any and all of the changes with you. So thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. Leave a like and subscribe for more IndyCar content, and I will see you in the next video.